Hi, they used to call me every day. Now they avoid even eye contact at the dinner table. Funny how time moves. Once, their tiny voices filled this house with laughter, questions, and the constant endearing chaos of youth. Now, it's the ticking of the kitchen clock and the clink of my own spoon against a cold plate that accompany me at dinner. I still cook for them. Habit, hope, or perhaps denial. Their favorite dishes, the ones they used to fight over. Tonight it was braised pork, slow-cooked just the way they liked it when they were kids. The smell filled the house, but no one came. I called out once, softly. "Dinner's ready?" No response. A few minutes passed. Then I heard one of the bedroom doors crack open. Just a sliver. Footsteps down the hall, then the fridge door. Someone grabbed a bottle of water. I waited, foolishly, thinking maybe they'd sit down. Instead, I heard them retreat, door shutting again like a wall being rebuilt. No thanks, no hi, not even a glance. And then, like a nail in the heart, a text, not even spoken to my face, just words lit on a screen. "We want to live without you." I stared at it for longer than I should have, rereading it again and again. "We want to live without you." 7 words, each like a cold stone in my chest. They were home, under the roof I built, breathing the warmth of a house I spent decades paying off. But somehow I was the outsider. I was the noise they wished would quiet down. I was the shadow that moved through the halls, tolerated, not welcomed. You know, they used to fight to sit next to me. "Dad, tell that story again." "No, I want to sit on Daddy's lap." That same living room that now echoes with emptiness once shook with giggles and bouncing feet on the old sofa. Now? It's just me and the whirring of the ceiling fan. How did it come to this? I wish I could say it happened overnight. But the truth is, distance doesn't fall like a tree. It creeps like vines, subtle and suffocating. At first, it was the eye rolls. Then came the sighs. Later, the avoidance. Eventually, the cruelty of indifference. You can tell when love begins to fade, but you don't want to admit it. They used to ask me for advice, lean on my shoulder after breakups, call me just to say, "Dad, you won't believe what happened today." Somewhere along the line, those calls stopped, replaced by silence, or worse, by resentment. I started to feel like a burden, like my presence was something to be negotiated, not cherished. Like every word I said was a disruption to some sacred peace they were desperately trying to preserve, without me in it. The house is the same. The walls still hold our memories. That photo on the wall, me holding them both on my shoulders at the beach, still hangs proudly. I sometimes catch myself looking at it while eating alone, as if it might speak to me, remind me that those smiles once existed outside of paper. It's not just the silence that hurts. It's the rewriting of everything we once were. Sometimes I wonder if I said too much, or maybe not enough. Did I become too rigid in my ways? Too outdated for their modern world? Did my warnings about responsibility sound like criticism to their ears? Did my sacrifices seem invisible simply because they were quiet? They accused me of being controlling, of not letting them grow. But was it so wrong to want them safe? To want them grounded? I see them drift, spending money they don't have, chasing things they don't need. And when I tried to speak up, I was met with that phrase I now know all too well. "Dad, it's our life. You don't get to control it." Control? I never wanted control. I wanted connection. I wanted to guide, to protect, to be there like I always was. but perhaps they mistook guidance for judgment. And now, I sit here, on this too large dining table, with too much food and not enough conversation, wondering when being a father became a crime. Do they know I still wake up early, listening for the sound of their footsteps? Do they know I sometimes leave the porch light on, hoping they'll come home late and we'll have one of those old, accidental, heart-to-heart midnight talks? Number they don't know, because they don't ask. They've closed the door. And I, foolishly, still knock. I used to be a hero in their eyes, the one who chased monsters from under the bed, who cheered the loudest at school recitals, who stood in the rain holding broken umbrellas just to keep them dry. But now I think they see me as something outdated, a relic of a different generation, a voice they'd rather mute than hear. It's not just painful, it's humiliating. To love someone with every beat of your heart and slowly watch them unlove you, not in anger but with apathy, is one of the cruelest endings a father can face. I wasn't prepared for this kind of goodbye, the kind where no one leaves, but everyone stops arriving. But maybe this is what they need. Maybe they need to live without me, to realize what they had, or what I tried to be. Or maybe they'll move on, and I'll become just a faded picture in some forgotten album. I don't know. All I know is that tonight, the house is silent. My food goes cold, and I feel like a guest in the very life I built. Still, something inside me refuses to crumble. I may not be wanted, but I am not worthless. I may be pushed aside, but I'm not invisible. Number, I still have something left to say. And perhaps when the time is right, they'll listen. Because being a father doesn't end when your children stop listening. Sometimes it begins again when they finally understand. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when I was everything to them. Not just a presence in the house, but the sun they revolved around, the hands they reached for in the dark. When their mother passed away, something inside me shattered. But I didn't have the luxury to grieve. Not the way I needed to. Grief for me came in quiet corners, behind closed bathroom doors, in muffled sobs under the shower. Because out there, in the kitchen, in the school pickup lines, in the hospital waiting rooms, I had to be strong. I had to be dad. The only one left. I still remember the first morning after the funeral. My daughter, barely 6, crawled into my bed, her tiny arms wrapping around my chest. She didn't say a word. She just clung to me, face buried in my shirt. Her brother stood in the doorway, his eyes swollen, clutching the stuffed lion his mother had given him. I opened my arms. He joined us. That morning, we didn't move for hours. We just held each other. 3 broken souls trying to feel whole. From that day on, I made them my purpose. Woke up every morning at 5 a.m. to prepare their breakfast. Combed my daughter's tangled hair the way her mom used to. Even learned to braid it from YouTube videos. I packed their lunches, walked them to school, showed up to every parent-teacher meeting in a shirt that barely fit right, because I didn't have time to shop or care. My world had narrowed down to 2 things: their safety and their happiness. I worked double shifts, canceled vacations, skipped meals so they could go on field trips. When my son had asthma attacks, I'd stay up all night by his side, hand on his back, counting his breaths. Once, when he spiked a fever the night before a major client pitch, I missed the meeting, lost the deal, lost the job, but he recovered. And that was all that mattered. One of the hardest days I ever faced was teaching my daughter to ride a bike. She fell, again and again, and each scrape on her knee felt like a dagger to my chest. "I can't do it, Daddy," she cried. I knelt down, cupped her cheeks, looked her straight in the eye. "You can. I believe in you more than anything." She wiped her tears, nodded, and tried again. On the seventh attempt, she soared forward like she had wings. I still remember her laugh. It split the sky open, pure and free. She turned back, screaming, "I'm doing it, Daddy!" And I ran after her, laughing, crying, breathless with pride. There were Christmases when we couldn't afford presents, so I made them instead. Handcrafted photo albums, paper dolls, a wooden train I carved from scrap. They lit up like it was gold. "You're the best dad in the world," they used to say, curling up beside me on the couch as we watched old cartoons and ate popcorn for dinner. Once my daughter had a school play, just a small part, 3 lines. But she begged me to be there. The same day, I had a job interview. My savings were dwindling. We needed the money. But when I saw her eyes, full of hope and nerves, I made the choice. I skipped the interview, sat in the 3rd row, and when she walked on stage and spotted me, she smiled like she'd just seen the sun rise inside the auditorium. That moment, I'll never forget it. Her performance was perfect. I was unemployed, but my heart was full. These kids, they were my everything. We had traditions. Friday movie nights with frozen pizza and soda. Sunday pancakes shaped like animals. I let them paint their bedroom walls, even when it turned into a mess of handprints and uneven stars. When they were scared of thunderstorms, they'd crawl into my bed and hide under my arms. "You'll keep us safe, right, Daddy?" And I always said, "Always." We used to laugh until our stomachs hurt, dance in the living room with the music too loud, bake cookies at midnight, failing every time but never caring. I didn't have a partner or a support system, but I had them. And in return, I gave them every part of me. I don't regret a single second of it, but time is a strange thing. Kids grow up, and the things that once amazed them, your magic tricks, your bedtime stories, start to feel silly. They begin to see your flaws, your cracks. They begin to compare, to question, to distance. First, they stop reaching for your hand. Then they stop answering your calls. Then they stop asking for your opinion. And worse, they stop valuing it altogether. I saw the change happening slowly. The eye rolls when I reminded them about bills. The sighs when I asked them how their day was. They began to treat me less like a father and more like an obligation. Then came the partners, the new voices in their lives. Suddenly I was old-fashioned, out of touch, too traditional. The house that was once ours became theirs, with me as an awkward guest overstaying his welcome. Still, I tried. I held on. I swallowed the pain, the rejection, the silence. I told myself it was just a phase, until the day they looked me in the eye, or rather didn't, and said, "We want to live without you." Just like that. The same children who once clung to my knees when I left for work. The same children who used to cry if I left the room. The same children whose scraped knees I kissed, whose nightlights I replaced, whose fears I banished with a single hug, now wanted me gone. Not out of hate. That would have been easier to understand, but out of convenience, out of cold, practiced detachment. And I was left breathless. I stood there, in the kitchen we built together, holding a plate of their favorite pasta, while the air between us thickened with all the words they didn't say, and the weight of everything I'd ever done for them, now invisible. How quickly we become burdens in the lives we once carried. I had always prepared myself for their independence. for them to leave the nest. But not like this. Not with slammed doors and dead phone lines. Not with silence and sideways glances. I gave them everything. My time, my love, my future. And I never asked for much in return, only that they remember. But I guess memories are fragile things, easily replaced by new voices, new loves, new definitions of home. Still, I find myself holding on to the past, to the soft weight of a child asleep on my chest, to the sound of their laughter echoing down the hallway, to that moment, just before the curtain rose on my daughter's first school play, when she whispered, "Don't forget to smile at me, Daddy. It gives me courage." I smiled then, and I'm smiling now, through the ache, because no matter what they say, I was there. I was the father they needed when the world fell apart, and I will always be, even if they forget, even if they choose to live without me. Because love, real love, doesn't disappear. It just waits, quietly, patiently, for the day they remember. The real unraveling didn't happen all at once. It came in whispers, in glances, in things left unsaid. But if I had to pinpoint when the house truly began to feel less like a home and more like a battlefield, I'd say it was after they got married. Marriage changes people. I expected that. I welcomed it even. I thought it would bring more joy into the house, more laughter, maybe even the patter of grandchildren's feet someday. And for a short while, it did. We had dinners with everyone at the table again, celebrations with too much food and not enough chairs. I remember sitting back on those days, watching them laugh with their spouses, thinking, this is what I raised them for, to build families of their own. But slowly, the temperature began to shift. Not suddenly, like a storm, but more like the subtle creep of winter. One day, you realize you're cold, and you can't quite remember when it began. It started with the tone. "Dad, you always do it that way. Can we just do it differently this time? Not everything has to be like when we were kids." Then, there were the sideways looks, from my daughter-in-law especially. She would smile, but the kind of smile that stops at the mouth and never touches the eyes. She never said anything outright at first, but I caught her expression when I served myself a portion at dinner. Or the way she wiped the counter behind me like I was somehow always in the way. One evening after dinner, I overheard her in the kitchen whispering to my son. She didn't know I was in the hallway. "He just sits around all day and still eats like he's paying rent. I mean, we're building our life. How long are we supposed to be caretakers?" Caretakers. That word stung more than I care to admit. I wanted to believe I was still part of their life, not some fragile antique they were stuck dusting. At first I stayed quiet. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was stress or money or the 1,000 things young couples go through. But it wasn't just her. At family discussions, they started cutting me off mid-sentence. I'd begin a story, and someone would glance at their phone or change the subject. If I brought up something from the past, anything that reminded them of our shared history, it was brushed off as nostalgia, as if my memories no longer mattered. One night, while I was reading in the living room, I overheard my daughter talking to her brother in the kitchen. "Dad always thinks he knows better. It's like we're not allowed to live our own lives without his input." Her voice wasn't angry. It was resigned. That somehow hurt more. Still, I tried to stay out of the way. I took to eating earlier or later than them. I avoided family gatherings unless asked. I thought that by minimizing my presence, I'd make it easier for them to breathe. But no matter how small I tried to make myself, I always seemed to be too much. The breaking point came when my son approached me with a business opportunity. That's what he called it. An investment into some new cryptocurrency coin he swore would blow up in a few months. He needed money. Not a little. A lot. "Dad, it's not like I'm asking for a handout," he said, pacing in front of me. "This is a chance. A real one. It's the future." I looked at him carefully. I remembered the same boy who once begged for an extra dollar for ice cream. And here he was, asking for tens of thousands. "I can't give you that kind of money," I told him gently. "It's too risky." He froze. "You're just scared. Because you don't understand it." "Maybe," I admitted. "But maybe I've lived long enough to know that easy money almost always comes at a high cost." His face darkened. "This is why we don't talk to you about things. You don't get it. You never will. You're stuck in the past, Dad. Your way of thinking, it's dying. You're like a relic, holding us back." A relic. That word landed like a hammer. I wanted to tell him that the money he wanted was part of my retirement, that it was all I had after years of raising them alone. But more than that, I wanted to tell him I wasn't trying to control him. I was trying to protect him. He didn't listen. The next few days were colder than ever. No one spoke to me unless it was necessary. Meals were taken in separate rooms. Doors were closed. My presence was something to be endured, not engaged. And then, one morning, over coffee I didn't ask to be joined for, they sat me down. "Dad," my daughter began, her voice rehearsed. "We've been thinking," my son chimed in. "It's time you considered having your own space, somewhere that's yours." I just stared at them. "What do you mean?" "You've lived here a long time," my daughter said carefully. "But we need more space now. We want to live as adults, independently. And we just feel like everyone would be happier if we had some boundaries," my son added. "Are you asking me to leave?" "We're asking you to consider it, for everyone's benefit." I didn't speak. I didn't trust myself to. I just nodded slowly and stood up. My legs felt heavier than they had in years. Back in my room, in the house I bought, in the home I built. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the family photos on the dresser. One of them was from a trip to the mountains. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, snow on our shoulders. That version of us felt like strangers now. Later that night, I heard laughter from the living room. They were watching a movie, popcorn in hand, like nothing had changed. Like they hadn't just asked their father to disappear. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I used to think that love was permanent, that what we'd built, the sacrifices, the memories, the blood and sweat that went into raising them, would earn me a seat at the table forever. But now, I was starting to see the truth. Sometimes love fades not because it wasn't real, but because it's inconvenient. And in that house, filled with furniture I bought, memories I created, walls I painted and repainted, I was no longer welcome. They wanted space. They wanted freedom. They wanted a life without me in it. And all I could think was, when did I become so easy to leave behind? The day I left wasn't loud. No slamming doors, no screaming matches, just the soft creak of floorboards and the quiet rustle of old clothes being folded into a worn suitcase. I packed my things slowly, with the methodical hands of a man who had nothing left to argue for. Every shirt folded carried a memory. Every drawer I emptied seemed to echo with laughter that no longer belonged to me. I didn't want them to see me leave. I didn't want the pity, or worse, the indifference. So I waited until the house was empty. My daughter had gone out with friends. My son and his wife were visiting her parents. I walked through each room one last time, touching the walls, the picture frames, the backs of the chairs at the dining table. I left the framed photo of us at the beach where it always sat. I couldn't bear to take it with me. I didn't want to carry that weight. I moved into the old property I used to rent out, a small, creaky house on the edge of town. It hadn't been occupied in months. Dust covered the counters. Cobwebs clung to the corners. But it was quiet. It was mine. And more importantly, it didn't carry their silence like poison in the walls. The first night alone was harder than I'd imagined. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down like a heavy coat. I could still hear them in my head. Bits of conversations, little jabs, long-forgotten giggles. They weren't memories so much as ghosts. They moved through me, uninvited, lingering. I tried to keep myself busy, fixed up the leaky faucets, repainted the peeling walls, replaced the broken screen door. I found comfort in routines, waking up early, making my coffee exactly the way I liked it, reading in the afternoons when the light hit the living room just right. But no amount of structure could quiet the ache of being unwanted. You don't realize how much space your heart occupies in someone else's world until they push you out of it. And yet, as the days passed, something strange happened. I started remembering. Not just the pain, but the joy, the beginnings, the tiny hand holding mine on the first day of school. The way they used to fight over who got to ride on my shoulders. The nights we spent building forts from sofa cushions and sheets, pretending we were explorers. These images came flooding back, clear and vivid, like a film reel I hadn't played in years. They weren't just my children. They were my life's work, my greatest investment. And now I was reaping the return. An empty house, a quiet phone, and a name no one said anymore. Then, one morning, as I was watering the wilting ferns on the porch, my phone buzzed. A message. From my son. "Dad, can we talk? I need a favor." I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type. Eventually, I just replied, "What is it?" A few minutes later, the next message came in. "Can you sign over the house to me? We want to use it as collateral for a business loan. Nothing big, just to help us get started. It would really mean a lot." I sat down, not because the request surprised me, but because of how casually it was delivered. Like it was a simple transaction, like the years I'd lived under that roof, raised them under its beams, meant nothing now except as financial leverage. They didn't know. They never asked. They'd never taken the time to understand the details of the life I'd built, the papers I'd signed, the assets I'd protected. They just assumed everything belonged to them now. That the house they'd exiled me from had somehow become theirs, but it hadn't. The house was mine, still under my name, and by a twist of practicality and a hint of self-preservation I never thought I'd be grateful for, I had never changed the title. When they'd moved in after college, I drafted a rental agreement, not to protect myself, but to make it easier on paper. It allowed them to pay what they could, to help them build credit. It was a formality, I thought, but now it was something else entirely. They weren't owners, they were tenants, legally, formally, undeniably. And I was still the landlord. I didn't respond to his message right away. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of irony pressing heavily against my chest. The same son who had once said I didn't understand the world he lived in, now asking me to sign over the very foundation he stood on. I thought about all the nights I spent fixing leaks in that house, all the repairs I paid for without asking, all the upgrades I made so they could live comfortably. I remembered repainting the nursery for his first child, changing the curtains because his wife didn't like the old ones, replacing the stove when they complained it was too old-fashioned. And yet, not once did they ask if the house was truly theirs. They just assumed. Because entitlement often walks hand in hand with forgetfulness. I put the phone down, brewed a fresh cup of coffee, watched the sun rise. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to remind them of what they owed. Time would do that for me, because sometimes silence is louder than any speech, and sometimes the best revenge isn't cruelty, it's clarity. They wanted me gone. They got what they asked for. But now they would begin to understand that cutting someone out of your life doesn't mean cutting their roots out of your foundation. Some roots run too deep, and some walls remember. There's a drawer in my old desk, third one down, right side, that I hadn't opened in years. It creaked when I pulled it out, the wood swollen from time, or perhaps from the weight of what it held. Inside, neatly stacked beneath yellowed documents and forgotten receipts, were the papers they never asked about. The ones I never showed. The deed to the house. The original property title. A rental agreement drafted in my handwriting, signed by them both when they moved in, more out of formality than necessity. Back then, I did it to protect everyone's dignity, to keep things clear, fair, structured. I didn't want anyone to feel indebted, even if deep down they were. But I never transferred the title, not because I wanted control, not out of spite or suspicion. I just waited. I told myself I would hand it over the day I felt they truly understood what the house represented. Not just bricks and beams, but legacy, sacrifice, roots, and maybe part of me feared that day would never come. The house wasn't just a home. It was the monument of my life's work. Every nail driven into its frame was a promise. To provide, to protect, to endure. It held more than furniture. It held memories. It held my wife's laughter in the kitchen, my daughter's first dance in the living room, my son's science fair disasters on the dining table. It held Sunday mornings, birthday candles, late-night sobs after broken hearts. I didn't want to give it to anyone who saw it as collateral instead of sanctuary. So I never signed it away. And now, sitting alone in my little rental home, their message still glowing coldly on my phone screen, I realized they saw it only for what it could do for them, not for what it meant to me. They wanted a signature. I decided to give them a lesson instead. The next afternoon, I walked into my lawyer's office. I hadn't seen Richard in years, but he still had the same easy calm, the same steady voice. "What brings you in, old friend?" he asked, offering me a seat. I placed the papers on his desk. "I need to initiate an eviction process." He blinked, surprised. "Eviction? For who?" "My tenants," I said simply. "My son and daughter-in-law." Silence. He studied me for a moment, as if searching my face for anger, bitterness, vengeance. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was resolved. "They asked me to sign the house over," I continued. "To take out a loan against it. They've forgotten it was never theirs to begin with." Richard nodded slowly, unfolding the documents. "You're still the sole owner. The rental agreement is valid. If this is what you want, I can have the notice ready in 3 days. Do it. Those 3 days were quiet. I didn't eat much. I didn't sleep well. Not because I doubted my choice, but because I still hoped, somewhere deep down, that they might remember, that they might call, not for a favor, not for a signature, but for something real. Something like, "Dad, how are you?" But the silence stayed. On the third day, Richard called. "It's done. Delivery confirmed." And just like that, the wheel turned. I imagined the scene in my old home, my son checking the mail, the moment his fingers brushed against the crisp envelope stamped with official lettering. Maybe he opened it right there on the porch, confusion morphing into disbelief. Maybe my daughter-in-law stood beside him, reading over his shoulder, her mouth falling open. I didn't have to imagine for long. That evening, my phone rang. The same number that had gone silent for months now lit up my screen. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Dad?" It was my son. His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the disorientation of someone who'd just had the world pulled out from under him. We got something from the court. About the house. Is this real?" I said nothing for a moment. I wanted to hear the weight of silence in his own ears. "Dad, why would you do this?" I could hear his wife in the background. "Ask him what the hell he's thinking. We have a baby on the way." Her voice, sharp and frantic, pierced the line. Finally, I spoke. "You both told me you wanted to live without me, that I was holding you back, that you needed your own space. I'm simply helping you do exactly that." "But eviction from our home." "Our home," I echoed quietly. "You mean my house, the one I built, the one I paid for, the one I never transferred because I was waiting to see if the people living in it remembered who made it a home in the first place." He was quiet now. "I gave you space," I continued. "I stepped aside. I lived alone. I didn't interfere. And when you finally reached out to me, it wasn't to check on me or say you missed me. It was to ask for more. More of what you believed was already yours. So no, I won't sign it over. And yes, I've ended the lease." There was a long pause. "Dad, we didn't mean to make you feel like this. It's just, life's been overwhelming. We were trying to figure things out." "We all are," I said softly. "But figuring things out doesn't give you license to forget who stood by you when you had nothing." He didn't reply. The weight of realization was finally pressing against him. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. "I'm doing this because sometimes the only way people learn to value something is when they risk losing it." The line went dead shortly after. I stared out the window for a long time that night, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. There was no joy in what I'd done, no smug satisfaction, only a quiet sorrow, a heavy heart. But beneath that sorrow, a certain peace. For the first time in years, I had stood up not just as a father, but as a man who refused to be erased. They could spin it however they wanted. Call it petty. Call it harsh. But deep down, they knew the truth. They were never entitled to that house. They were never entitled to me. And maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of them learning what it means to truly earn something. The house stood quiet again, but this time it was their silence that echoed through the rooms. After the eviction notice took effect, they left within weeks. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic goodbye. Just the slow, reluctant packing of boxes and the muffled tension of footsteps on creaking floors. The once vibrant laughter that had filled the halls was now replaced with the hollow drag of tape across cardboard and the closing of doors that no longer belonged to them. They moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from work, far from friends, far from comfort. It was modest. 2 cramped bedrooms, thin walls, no natural light. A downgrade in every possible sense. No backyard for their child to play in. No room for guests. No familiar creaks in the floors. No history in the walls. I didn't need to see it to know how stark the contrast must have been. Life has a way of revealing its lessons not through punishment, but through absence. And it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Not in the walls of the apartment, but in their marriage. I heard later, through a cousin, that the arguments began over furniture, then over finances, then, inevitably, over me. He could have just signed the paper, my son had said, more than once, bitter and defensive. But his wife, once so sure of her footing, had started to see things differently. Maybe he wouldn't have done it if we hadn't pushed him out. Maybe this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't treated your father like a burden. Regret is a strange thing. It never comes when you expect it. It shows up quietly, in the dead of night, in the corners of your mind when you least want to remember. In the sound of your child asking why Grandpa doesn't visit anymore. In the moment you reach for the phone and realize you don't know what to say. In the recognition that you traded trust for pride and lost both. Eventually, they reached out. The first message was simple. "Dad, can we talk?" I read it once and put the phone down. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew they needed to sit with their own silence a little longer. They'd spoken, loudly with their actions. Now they had to listen to the echoes. A few days later, another message came. This one longer, apologetic. My son asked if we could meet, just to talk. No expectations, no requests, just time. I agreed, but not at the house. Not the one they left without looking back. Not the place that had once held our memories, but had since been emptied of warmth. We met at a quiet cafe in the old part of town. It was a place we used to visit when they were young. After school, after soccer practice, after report cards. The same checkered tables, the same creaky stools, but everything else had changed. When I arrived, they were already seated. My son stood when he saw me, awkwardly, like a boy unsure of how to greet his father. His wife looked up from her coffee, eyes tired, no longer sharp with certainty. There was a long pause. "Hi, Dad," he said. "Hello," I replied, sitting down. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was fragile, like a bridge being rebuilt one quiet breath at a time. He was the first to speak again. "I'm sorry. For everything. We pushed you out. And we were wrong." His wife nodded. "We were angry. Stressed. But that doesn't excuse how we treated you." I looked at them both. Older now. Not just in years, but in humility. "I forgive you," I said. "But I don't forget." They nodded, and they didn't argue. For the next hour, we spoke carefully, like people learning a language they once knew fluently but had forgotten through disuse. They told me about the apartment, about the struggle, about the realization that family isn't something you outgrow. It's something you protect. They didn't ask to come back. Not once. And I respected that. They understood now that home isn't just a space. It's a relationship, a trust, one that, once broken, takes time to rebuild. As we stood to leave, my son hesitated. Then he stepped forward and hugged me. Not the stiff, one-armed gestures of obligation, but a full, grounded embrace, the kind a man gives to the person who raised him. "I miss you, Dad," he whispered. "I miss you too," I said. We parted ways after that meeting. I didn't invite them over, and they didn't push. But something had shifted. There was weight in their eyes now. Awareness, humility, and in place of pride, there was room for grace. I returned to my little home, the one that had become both refuge and exile. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Sometimes regret is the soil in which understanding grows. And maybe now, they finally understood what it meant to be family. Not in words, but in actions. I don't live with them anymore. That chapter has ended, and I've made peace with it. I suppose in some strange way, the house and I were both set free at the same time. But every now and then, I visit. Not as a resident, not as someone tiptoeing around his own kitchen, but as something entirely different now, a guest of honor, a presence they prepare for. Someone whose arrival is no longer met with sighs or silence, but with warm greetings, chairs pulled out, and cups of tea set carefully on the table. And most importantly, genuine eyes that meet mine again. The first time I returned, the door was opened not by my son, but by a small whirlwind in the form of his daughter, my granddaughter. She had her mother's eyes, but my daughter's wild curls. The moment she saw me, her face lit up like dawn breaking. "Grandpa!" She threw her arms around me, unfiltered and fierce, like someone who had been thirsty for something she hadn't known she was missing. It almost broke me. That day, I didn't linger too long. I stayed just long enough to catch up, to smile at old jokes, to hear about the new job my son had taken on, and how they were slowly finding balance again. It was still their house, but this time, they didn't act like I was intruding. They made room. Now I come by once or twice a month, birthdays, Sunday lunches, sometimes just because the weather is nice. My visits are simple, filled with short conversations, small joys, and the tiny, tender moments that once seemed forever lost. My grandchildren have become my bridge, reminding all of us that love can skip a generation, but it always finds its way back. But I don't spend all my time there. I've found other places to pour myself into. Not long after the dust settled, I started something new, something for myself. I opened a small writing group for seniors at the community center just down the block. A simple idea at first. A place for people my age to gather, talk, write, remember. I called it Second Chapters. At first, we were only 5. Me, a retired nurse, a former postman, a widow who wrote poetry on napkins, and a man who claimed he once ghost-wrote romance novels, but never dared publish under his real name. We sat in a circle, sharing stories no one had asked for in decades. Childhood memories, heartbreaks, meals remembered not for their taste, but for who sat at the table. Week by week, more people joined. They came not just to write, but to be heard. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just a father or a man who'd been left behind. I was a storyteller, a guide, a voice people leaned into. And somehow, in telling our stories, we all began healing parts of ourselves we didn't know were still bruised. I found purpose there. Not the kind you chase in youth, but the kind that quietly grows in your later years, rooted in reflection, watered by resilience. You see, I've learned something over these past few months, something that years of parenting, heartbreak, and silence never taught me. Not everyone who becomes a parent will be loved for it. Children don't always remember the sacrifices. Spouses don't always appreciate the hands that build the home. And sometimes, no matter how much you give, what's returned may be indifference, but dignity Dignity is different. Dignity is what you keep when everything else is stripped away. Dignity is what lets you forgive without forgetting, to give space without surrendering self-worth. It's what allows you to be kind without being naive, firm without being cruel. And in the end, it's not always love that earns you respect. It's the quiet way you carry yourself through the storm, without asking the sky for mercy. My children may never fully understand what it cost me to walk away without slamming the door. They may never know the nights I wept alone, or the restraint it took to not fight back with bitterness. But that's no longer the point. Because we've all grown since then. We've all softened in the way people do after the heat of pride has cooled. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we've become something new. Not the family we once were, perhaps, but one that is learning, healing, becoming. A new kind of family. One that meets at cafes before coming home. One that listens more than it speaks. One that doesn't take presents for granted. And as I sit now, watching my granddaughter draw with crayons at my feet, while her parents cook in the kitchen behind me, I wonder, not with bitterness, but with quiet curiosity. If I had given in sooner, been more agreeable, more accommodating, would they have seen my worth sooner? Would this moment have come earlier? Would the pain have been avoided? But almost as soon as the thought arrives, I let it go. Because maybe that was never the question that mattered.